Two former law enforcement members who had been charged in connection with an illegal marijuana operation in Franklin County have had those charges dismissed. Former Wilton officer Kevin LeMay of Farmington and former Oxford County Deputy James McClam of Auburn had been charged with tampering with documents. But according to the Sun-Journal, a federal judge dismissed those charges because prosecutors did not demonstrate LeMay and McClam knew or foresaw there would be a future grand jury investigation into the marijuana operation, or that their actions would affect those proceedings. More than 10 people and several businesses were indicted after the alleged drug operation was busted in 2021.